Hi, my name's Andy Rasman. This is a series going through Genesis. We're now in Genesis chapter 4. We just saw the beginning of mankind and how from Adam and Eve being the first man and woman, their sin led to them being kicked out of this paradise, the Garden of Eden that God had created for them, and they were not to be able to return to it. So where are we now? Adam and Eve had a child. And I encourage you to read chapter 4 before watching the rest of this video. When in verse 1, what does Eve call her son Cain when he is born? A man. And the question would be, why not a son? So from Luther's commentary on Genesis, he said, and Eve said, I have gotten the man of the Lord. From this statement, another reason may be gathered why Eve did not call Cain a son, namely, that because of her excessive joy and reverence, she was unwilling to call him son, but had something greater in mind about him, as though Cain would be the man who would crush the head of the serpent. For this reason, she does not simply call him a man, but the man of the Lord, of whom the Lord had promised. And that's going back to Genesis 3:15. So it's a very interesting thought that Luther has that Eve would have been thinking that Cain, her first son, would have been the offspring that was promised. Very interesting thought, and we see this play out more with the second son. So let us look at that. She does have a second son, and so with that thought, and the second son was Abel, and what we see is that, I'm sure to Eve's great surprise, this son that she thought was the chosen one, the one that was promised to crush the head of the serpent, actually ends up killing her son Abel. That's how it went down. And it was because Cain was jealous over Abel's sacrifice being pleasing to the Lord and not his own. And so the question, we're not necessarily the question yet on the sacrifices, but the name Cain actually means acquired. All right, so maybe this would be Eve had acquired all that she needed with Cain, or that Cain would be the one who would acquire or buy the freedom that they longed for, the escape under the curse that came through listening to that rotten snake in chapter 3. But then Abel comes along, and the name Abel means vanity. And so he's kind of like the extra accessory that is a vanity. Or if you think to Ecclesiastes, the author is speaking of vanity of vanities, right? All this stuff under the sun that we're chasing after, it's all vanity. And so this is very concerning with these names being given. That alone could have given much to Cain's downfall. So Cain being jealous of Abel's sacrifice being accepted and not his own, or pleasing to the Lord and not his own, could go back to this here. Like, I'm the one who's acquired. I am not the vanity. So who is this guy? Who is my little brother to be the one to please the Lord? And I'll talk more on that about the sacrifice and why Abel's was more pleasing, and potentially Cain might have thought his was more pleasing. I'll talk about that in a moment. But what do these names indicate? Certainly indicates what I spoke about. Certainly indicates maybe Eve and even Adam's disposition towards Cain and Abel. And we see that this can end up being some of the problems that come in other families in the Bible, especially through Genesis when we read the struggle between Jacob and Esau. Certainly it seems as if Isaac favors Esau over Jacob, and the kind of conflict that this can bring about, and also the older versus younger, and the older being favored, and the conflict that comes about them. We can see this in our own families, can we not? So how do we fall into this trap? How do we avoid this problem? Thinking of this, I know a good number of families that potentially you have a son or daughter that is like really gifted at sports, and the family is just a sports family. right? They love you know this. Like sports are a religion to some Americans, and especially following after certain teams. And so imagine if you have a sibling in the family who is great at sports and ends up actually getting a full ride sports scholarship to the football team that the family worships. I mean, how much is that child going to be elevated and praised potentially above other children who maybe are not athletic at all in the family. So this sort of stuff can emerge. Same thing can happen if a family values academics and doing math over sports. You got a kid that's just like, man, I'm a great sports athlete, but not so much on the homework. But the other kid is really good at homework. Or if you're in a music family and like all the kids are musical except the one. I mean, this sort of stuff can happen. And so it is probably a trap we need to avoid by looking to each person in the family and seeing how God has uniquely gifted each individual in the family, recognizing that we don't all have the same interests. Parents taking interest in those kids that maybe aren't necessarily drawn to the hobbies and interest of the parent, and just holding balance in the family and not favoring one over the other and treating your one kid as a vanity. I actually know a family where someone was adopted in the family, and it became like a running joke in the family. Oh, well, he's the adopted one, right? Because he didn't live up to the standards, or he didn't quite meet the standards or expectations of the family, or wasn't quite as smart or with it, and just said awkward things sometimes. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, you adopted the kid late, and he had a really rough childhood growing up before you adopted him, and you've provided a lot for him. But does that really help whenever he makes a shortcoming or stumbles in some ways to point out, well, he's the adopted one? I don't think so at all. It probably caused some animosity and strife, and from what I understand now, that adopted kid isn't really with the rest of the family, and maybe I can see why years later in hindsight, some of how the dynamic was in the family, it could have led him to be like, well, I never really was that accepted by you guys to begin with, so I'm not going to stick around, especially since he's still outside the mold of the family and what they think. So that's stuff for us to be aware of, and we need to make sure we don't fall into those traps. It can be very dangerous, pitting sibling against sibling, and making the sibling relationship be one that is a rivalry. Not good at all. It needs to be avoided. It's a warning that we see here. All right, next, to answer that other question, which was about why was Cain's sacrifice not pleasing to God? Now, something I hadn't really thought about here until reading Luther's commentary on this is that at this time, they didn't eat meat. We remember this. I know this is like absurd and quite frankly insane for most of us to be thinking about that they didn't eat meat, especially if you want to bring in Darwinian evolution and all that garbage into your theology, which isn't found in Scripture. I mean, it says very clearly in Genesis that even the animals had vegetation to eat, and it's not until later in Genesis that they're told and given permission to eat meat. So on that front, Abel, being the herdsman, in some ways might have been looked down upon. Meat might not have been as favored as it is today. And so Cain, being the farmer that grew the crops that would be eaten, might have had the better offering in his mind. But what we see is that's not the case, because Abel gave of the best of the animals. He sacrificed the best of the animals, and he gave the best portions of the animals as burnt offerings unto the Lord. And then with Cain, he didn't give the first fruits. He essentially gave the leftovers at the end of the harvest. And so that really is the highlight here of giving the best to God and letting Him have access to the first of what, in fact, He has given to you and blessed you with. So that's why Cain's sacrifice was not pleasing to God. He wasn't giving of the first, and he really was giving of the leftovers which is, I mean, if you think about it, who gets the leftovers in the house? Usually the dog. So it's not really putting God in his rightful place. Other questions that emerge on this section usually deal with Cain when he is then marked and sent out, and he's told that he won't be killed. And so there's big questions here. Where'd all these other people come from? It seems as if Cain expects everyone to want to kill him. So who are all these other people? Where did he get his wife from? And when you read through the account, it does say in this chapter that Adam and Eve had other children, other sons and daughters, and it doesn't name them all. We just get Cain and Abel, likely because it's from Abel that we end up getting the Messiah. And I'm sorry, not Abel. I'm stupid of me. Cain kills Abel, and then Seth is the next child mentioned. So you get Cain and Abel named because that's who has the murder. Are they even the first ones? I don't know. Cain seems to be first when you do the reading, but Cain does kill Abel, and then you have Seth. And so those three are mentioned because they have high importance in the narrative. Cain, the first murderer, and then it tracks Cain's descendants for a while, and then it tracks Seth's descendants. And you end up seeing something, I think, very important between the tracking of those two lineages. But they had many sons and daughters, and it doesn't name them all. And so Cain's wife, we don't know who she is. A lot of people end up seeming to think that God had to somehow create for him a wife, and so that wouldn't really work because God doesn't create sinners. He doesn't create sinful beings. He created us very good, and then we fell into sin. So he created a special wife just for Cain, as many people actually believe, if you haven't heard this, it would mean he had to have created her sinless. And so none of that really works, and it's not from Scripture that we get any indication of this. You can go outside the Bible, and maybe there can be some writings that speak of this, that God had to create a special being, special woman for Cain, but it's not there. So one of Adam and Eve's descendants, either a son or daughter or potentially a granddaughter, would have married Cain, and that's the case for all of the first humans. They were intermarrying, and it's not until much later that they are told not to have those types of incestual relationships. And there's a lot of speculation as to why it was okay in the beginning and not the end, but a lot of that speculation just goes with maybe the genes weren't as bad. They hadn't, bad genes hadn't been reinforced as much yet, or different things along those lines, more closer to perfection than the degradation which continues. You see also in this the question of where did all those people come from that he's afraid of. Same thing. It's just the descendants. We're not necessarily given the time frame of how old Cain and Abel were when this murder took place. We just know they weren't yet married. That's chapter 4 thus far. We shall continue reading the genealogies. That's up next. Genealogies.